October 2010, Helmand Province, Afghanistan. In the middle of the deadliest coalition war of a generation, a squadron of British SAS operators looked their American allies in the eye and refused to follow their orders. Not out of arrogance, not out of recklessness, but out of a principle so fundamental it nearly fractured the coalition from within. The Americans wanted control over an operation, and the British simply said, "Not happening." It was a moment that drew a clear line in the sand, where experience and autonomy outweighed bureaucracy. To understand why, you need to understand where they were and what kind of war they were in. By 2010, the conflict in Afghanistan had been raging for 9 years. What began as a swift mission in response to the attacks of September 11th had grown into a sprawling, complicated campaign. The Americans had surged troops, 30,000 more, and the coalition counted 130,000 soldiers. Generals reported progress, politicians spoke of turning points, and winning was still mentioned in press conferences, though the men on the ground had long stopped believing in it. In Britain, the public was exhausted. 2009 had been the deadliest year yet, with 108 soldiers killed. Every few days, a flag-draped coffin passed through small towns like Wooden Bassett, and thousands of people stood silently in the streets. No one had asked them to come. They came because they knew something had gone terribly wrong. Helmand Province was the epicenter of that failure. The British had taken responsibility for Helmand in 2006. Commanders spoke then of winning hearts and minds, reconstruction, leaving without firing a shot. Those promises had aged poorly. Helmand had become one of the deadliest places on earth for any soldier in a Western uniform. The Helmand River ran through it like a spine, flanked by green fields of poppy that funded the Taliban, stretching into endless pale desert beyond. Every day brought the risk of IEDs hidden in irrigation ditches, compounds that could hide both families and fighters, and the invisible shifting threat of the Taliban blending into the civilian population. The upper Helmand Valley around Nahar-e-Sarraj was especially lethal. The farmland was deceptive, crops dense enough to conceal an IED, muddy compounds that could house both a grandfather sipping chai and a fighter ready to ambush at noon. For soldiers, the line between enemy and civilian did not exist. It was a blur. Operating in that blur required a particular kind of soldier, and the SAS was precisely that. The squadron operating in Helmand in October 2010 consisted of men who had earned their place through one of the toughest selection processes in the world. Many had been in Iraq, facing urban warfare in Basra and other hotspots. The youngest were in their late 20s, most in their 30s, calm from having been scared many times and learned to work through it. Their mission was clear: operate independently, strike fast and quietly, make decisions in the field. But by this time, autonomy was under threat. The Americans had built a massive machine, JSOC, running hundreds of raids every month, demanding visibility over every operation, including SAS missions. The first sign of change came in a briefing room at Camp Bastion. An American colonel outlined a new command structure. British Special Operations would now require JSOC approval, with a minimum 48-hour window. SAS officers listened, the air conditioning hummed, the temperature outside pushing 50 degrees Celsius, dust and jet fuel filling the room, rotor blades thudding faintly in the distance. When the colonel finished, One SAS officer simply stood and walked out. No shouting, no drama, just a quiet statement. British soldiers had come as partners, not subordinates. Those who had survived the brutal selection process were not about to take orders from someone else's chain of command. It was a small, silent act, but it carried weight far beyond the room. Patrols went out daily, sometimes before dawn, when the air was cold and the Helmand sky dark blue, stars so close they seemed within reach. Sometimes, in the blistering heat of afternoon, armor turning into an oven, the weight of weapons, ammunition, water, and radio, 30 to 40 kilograms, pressing down. SAS operators moved differently than regular infantry, quietly, carefully, watching every detail. The behavior of a dog near a compound, the direction a farmer walked when they approached, the absence of children, all signaled danger. Their interpreter, known as Khalid, was Hazara, not Pashtun, with memories of massacres a decade prior. He spoke 4 languages, understood the silences between words, and could read deception and threat like a map. During one meeting with village elders north of Nari Saraj, Khalid quietly told the senior operator 3 men in the room would make phone calls within the hour. Not out of loyalty to the Taliban, but fear. The operator asked, "Do they want us here?" Khalid replied, "They want what you can give them, but they are not sure it will last long enough." The gap between briefings and reality on the ground was tangible. The American method, high-volume, rapid strikes, worked on paper. But SAS had seen the aftermath. One removed facilitator created 40 new enemies. The 2 logics did not align. The operators had to reconcile doctrine with consequence. Even at the small human level, war weighed heavily. Operators who had lost comrades to IEDs months earlier carried grief that was quiet but constant. Letters home remained unsent, folded in kit bags, documenting doubts, uncertainty, and the evolving understanding of what winning meant. Afghans they met were more complex than intelligence reports suggested. Farmers, children, elders, all caught in the same turbulent currents as the soldiers. By October 2010, British soldiers in Helmand had lost over 340 personnel in the campaign. The SAS had casualties too, often quietly, unannounced, mourned in private in Herefordshire, a small town that carried grief silently. Those who survived carried experience, instinct, and caution, habits honed in extreme conditions, habits that would remain long after they returned home. The patrols pressed on. The SAS squadron relied on instinct and precise intelligence, moving in the green zone, weighing every action against potential consequences. The land itself seemed designed to test judgment. Irrigation ditches, mud compounds, hidden paths through poppy fields. Every decision could be the difference between life and death. And above it all, the American insistence on oversight hung like a shadow. The principle at stake, British soldiers answering only to a British chain of command, was about to be tested, and the operators knew it. The moment had not yet arrived, but it was coming. Every patrol, every observation, every interaction with locals in Nahar-e-Sarraj built toward that confrontation. The sun had barely risen over the upper Helmand Valley near Nahar-e-Sarraj, casting a muted orange light over the dusty fields. The SAS squadron was already moving, methodical and silent, their heavy packs pressing down, every step deliberate. The men were veterans of conflicts that had scarred their bodies and minds, yet they moved with a precision that made their presence almost invisible. Every patrol carried the weight of months of intelligence gathering, analysis, and anticipation. Every compound they passed, every farmer who paused and looked their way, every shift in the air carried meaning. The patrols were as much about observation as action. Operators watched the local population, noting subtle movements. A boy disappearing behind a wall, a farmer's gaze lingering too long, a dog reacting oddly to a passing vehicle. These signs, small to the untrained eye, were often more telling than any map or report. SAS training had conditioned them to interpret nuance, to sense danger before it emerged. Khaled, the Hazara interpreter, moved alongside them, eyes sharp, scanning faces, and listening to silences. He had been with the British forces since 2006, and in his quiet, precise way, he often knew what was about to happen before anyone else did. One afternoon, as the squadron moved along a narrow dirt track flanked by poppy fields, Khaled whispered that a Taliban facilitator had been spotted moving through a nearby village. The operator in charge, a man who had seen war in Iraq and Afghanistan, nodded silently. This was the kind of intelligence they had built their operations around: timely, precise, actionable. The Americans, by contrast, wanted oversight, control, and timelines that didn't always account for the fluidity on the ground. The tension between British independence and American command had not yet reached a breaking point, but the cracks were widening. JSOC's insistence on pre-approval for missions felt constraining to men trained to act decisively. The SAS had operated for decades with autonomy as a core principle. To cede control, even to allies, was unthinkable. And yet, the Americans were not wrong by their logic. They were simply operating under a different doctrine, one based on systems, oversight, and volume. The two approaches were fundamentally incompatible. As the patrol approached a small compound north of Nar-e-Sarraj, Khaled signaled them to halt. From the vantage of a low rise, the operators could see movement within the compound. A man carrying crates disappeared behind a mud wall. Another moved cautiously, scanning the fields. The SAS assessed. This was not a random farmer. This was someone moving resources, facilitating the Taliban's operations. Their intelligence had been correct. The mission parameters were clear: act swiftly, minimize collateral damage, and gather actionable evidence. Back at Camp Bastion, JSOC had issued a reminder. Any action in this area now required American approval. The SAS squadron commander had read the message, set it down, and for a moment considered it. Then he picked up the radio and sent a response that was deliberate, flat, and unmistakable. The British element would not defer. The mission would proceed on their timeline, under British command, according to British rules of engagement. It was not a dramatic confrontation. No words were shouted, no threats issued. But the message carried weight. It was the assertion of principle over protocol, experience over bureaucracy. And in that moment, the SAS made clear that autonomy was not negotiable. The patrol advanced into the green zone, each operator moving in calculated steps. The heat was oppressive. The weight of their gear made every movement a physical struggle. Yet their focus was unbroken. Every window, doorway, and alleyway was a potential threat. Every sound was analyzed: the rustle of crops, a distant dog bark, the murmur of a conversation. They had trained for this for years, yet the reality of Helmand was always more complex than any exercise. Inside the compound, the men located their target. the facilitator identified by intelligence. He was alone, momentarily unguarded. The operation was executed with precision. The target was detained, no civilians harmed, and the team withdrew before anyone could react. The Americans, monitoring from afar, could only watch. There was no defiance in attitude, no challenge in demeanor, only the cold efficiency of soldiers doing what they had been trained to do, operating within the bounds of their own rules. After the operation, as the patrol moved back to base, Khaled walked beside the squadron commander. He said quietly, "They understand you, but they do not understand why." The commander nodded. This was not about proving superiority. It was about preserving the integrity of their mission and the principle that allowed them to function effectively in environments that defied control. The line between civilian and combatant remained blurred. Every village held the potential for cooperation or conflict, and the operators understood that one misstep could undo weeks of work. They moved carefully, balancing force with diplomacy, action with restraint. Helmand demanded this balance. The landscape itself was a teacher. Irrigation ditches, hiding explosives, compounds masking fighters, fields that could conceal life or death at a glance. That night, back at Camp Bastion, the squadron gathered for after-action review. Maps were spread, movements retraced, decisions analyzed. The Americans had requested input on every step, but the SAS officers filtered the discussion through their own operational lens. They were accountable to their own chain of command, not JSOC, and every decision reflected that chain. In the quiet moments, the weight of the war pressed on them. The loss of comrades, the uncertainty of the mission's broader impact, the complexity of human terrain, all of it settled in their minds. Letters home remained folded in kit bags, unsent, documenting the thoughts and doubts that could not be shared. What did winning look like? The answer was elusive. What mattered was doing what was right in the moment, guided by experience, training, and principle. The next day brought another patrol, another opportunity for observation, another chance to reinforce the boundaries between autonomy and oversight. The SAS moved through villages, fields, and compounds with practiced precision. Khaled remained their eyes and ears, translating not just words but context, emotion, and intention. Every interaction was a small victory or a warning, a chance to understand the invisible currents that governed life in Helmand. Above all, the operators knew that their principle, the refusal to defer to JSOC, was more than protocol. It was survival, efficiency, and the preservation of what made the SAS effective. They were not rejecting allies. They were defending the doctrine that had been forged in deserts, jungles, and cities over decades. Autonomy was their armor, experience their weapon, and principle their guide. By the end of that week, the squadron had gathered more intelligence, executed operations with precision, and reinforced the understanding that British Special Forces did not operate under foreign command. The Americans respected them, not out of fear, but out of recognition of competence. The human bonds between operators remained strong, despite institutional tension, and the SAS, as ever, operated on its own terms, in its own time, in a war that would not forgive mistakes. October 2010 had reached its peak heat, and the SAS squadron was operating near Garmsir, a stretch of Helmand where poppy fields bled into barren desert. The air was thick with dust, the sun pressing down like a relentless weight. Patrols moved slowly but deliberately, each operator alert to every shadow, every movement. The enemy here was fluid. A farmer at dawn, a facilitator at noon, a fighter by night. The distinction between civilian and combatant had long vanished. The squadron's operations had begun to draw attention beyond Helmand. JSOC, overseeing hundreds of raids across the country, demanded oversight. Every mission, every target, every patrol was to be reported, reviewed, and approved before execution. For the SAS, this was more than bureaucratic friction. It was an existential challenge. The regiment's effectiveness had always depended on autonomy. Acting decisively in the moment, without waiting for external approval, was encoded into their doctrine. On a sweltering afternoon at Camp Bastion, an American colonel presented a new directive. All British Special Forces operations were to be submitted for JSOC review, with a minimum 48-hour approval window. The SAS officers exchanged silent glances. No words were spoken at first, but the room was heavy with unspoken understanding. One officer, calm and measured, rose and walked out. That simple gesture sent a clear message. British forces would not become subordinate. The principle of independent command was non-negotiable. That night, under a canopy of stars, the squadron prepared for a high-value target mission near Musakala, a town infamous for shifting allegiances and hidden threats. Intelligence indicated a Taliban logistics facilitator was moving weapons and fighters through the area. The Americans sent word. This mission would now be run under JSOC control. The SAS commander read the message, set it down, and made a decision rooted in decades of precedent. Using the radio, he responded in the flat, precise tone of the British military. The operation would proceed on the SAS timeline under British command. Approval from JSOC was not required. The message was not defiant. It was factual. "We do not take orders from JSOC," he said. That simple statement drew a line in the sand. It was principle over procedure, experience over hierarchy. The silence on the other end of the line was long enough to communicate comprehension and respect. Moving into the green zone, the squadron carried the weight of months of intelligence, every patrol, every loss, every success. The terrain was deceptive. Irrigation ditches perfect for hiding IEDs, compounds that could conceal families or fighters, paths that shifted between life and death, depending on the observer. Every step was deliberate, every movement calculated. SAS operators moved differently from regular infantry, quieter, slower at times, faster when required, absorbing the environment with practiced vigilance. Inside a compound near Musakala, the facilitator was located. He moved cautiously, unaware that eyes and ears had been tracking him for weeks. The operation was executed with precision, the target detained, no civilians harmed. The SAS withdrew into the surrounding fields, melting into the landscape as if they had never been there. The Americans observed from a distance, powerless to intervene, witnessing the regiment act decisively within its own framework. After the mission, Khaled, the Hazara interpreter, walked beside the squadron commander. He spoke quietly, almost as if to himself, "They understand your actions, but they do not understand why you must act this way." The commander nodded, knowing that the answer was rooted in doctrine, history, and survival. The SAS could not operate effectively if every decision had to pass through external review. Autonomy was not arrogance. It was the lifeblood of their effectiveness. The days that followed were a mixture of routine and tension. Patrols continued across Helmand, through Garmsir, Narisarai, and the surrounding villages. Operators observed, analyzed, and acted, Every village visit, every interaction with elders or farmers, every silence carried meaning. Letters home remained folded in kit bags, unsent, chronicling doubt, loss, and reflection. What did winning look like? The answer remained elusive. What mattered was acting correctly in the moment, guided by experience, principle, and training. Institutional friction followed them even into quiet moments. Had they been right to refuse JSOC? Had the principle been worth the tension? Answers were complex and unresolved, but the SAS squadron continued its mission. They respected their American allies personally, but their operational autonomy remained untouchable. The partnership between operators was strong, forged in combat and trust. Yet at the institutional level, principle held firm. The weight of 9 years of war pressed down. The British military had lost over 340 personnel in Afghanistan. Each operator carried personal loss. Comrades lost to IEDs, firefights, or misfortune. Memories of the fallen lingered in silent folds of kit bags, in letters never sent, in quiet recollections during patrols and briefings. The line between grief and duty blurred. The only certainty was the mission and the principle that guided it. By the end of October 2010, the SAS squadron had reinforced the understanding. British Special Forces answered only to the British chain of command. Autonomy, experience, and principle dictated every operation. JSOC had seen the effectiveness of the regiment firsthand, and respect replaced tension. The relationship at the human level remained strong, yet the line drawn in Helmand dust had established a precedent that would endure beyond that single mission. And in that moment, the regiment's identity was preserved. The principle that David Stirling had forged in the deserts of North Africa in 1941, small teams operating with independence, trusted judgment, and speed, remained alive. It was the foundation that allowed them to function where others could not, the reason they had survived, and the reason they could continue to act effectively in one of the most dangerous provinces in the world. By late 2010, the SAS squadron had solidified its position across Helmand Province. Nar-e-Sarraj and Garmsir remained volatile, each village a puzzle of allegiance, survival, and hidden threat. Yet the principle had been upheld. British operators answered only to their own command. JSOC had watched, learned, and respected the decision, acknowledging that some operations required independence. The regiment's identity had survived, unbroken, even in a coalition war defined by scale, bureaucracy, and relentless operational tempo. The months that followed were a mix of routine and reflection. Patrols continued, sometimes before dawn, when the valley was still wrapped in darkness, sometimes at high noon, when the sun hammered down relentlessly. The operators moved through the green zones differently from others, every movement precise, every glance meaningful, every decision weighted with experience and principle. They observed farmers, elders, and children, understanding that allegiance in Helmand was fluid. Civilians were not always neutral, nor were they always aligned with the Taliban. Survival dictated choices more than ideology. Khaled, the interpreter, remained indispensable. His insight into local dynamics, knowledge of languages, and nuanced understanding of behavior made the difference between life and death. He observed the operators with a quiet, analytical patience, translating not just words but intentions, pauses, and the subtle signals that revealed truth. "They act as they must," he once said, because the ground does not forgive mistakes and principle is their shield. In late 2014, the drawdown of British forces approached its conclusion. Camp Bastion, once a sprawling hub of coalition power, was to be handed over to the Afghan National Army. The Union flag was lowered, the Afghan flag raised, and British soldiers departed without ceremony. Months of construction, hundreds of millions of pounds, and the lives of 453 British personnel culminated in a quiet morning. Within weeks, reports surfaced of the base being stripped for valuable equipment: copper, wiring, generators. Anything movable disappeared under the watch of Afghan forces. Those who had served there were not surprised. The transient nature of occupation and influence was clear. Helmand had its own rhythm, one that did not bend to foreign intentions. For the SAS operators, the end of deployment brought no parades, no media coverage, no medals. They returned quietly through the Welsh countryside, their minds carrying the patterns, habits, and vigilance honed in Helmand. Back at home, green hills replaced dust-choked fields, quiet streets replaced the constant hum of helicopters. Yet the body does not easily forget war. Operators remained alert, sitting with backs to walls, scanning rooftops, and calculating exits in supermarkets or schools. Sleep came in fragments. The mind revisited scenarios, patrols, and losses. War had left its mark, not just on the landscape, but on their nervous systems and sense of time. The command dispute with JSOC, though settled operationally, lingered intellectually. Had the decision been worth it? Could principle outweigh the friction it created with allies? The answers were complex, nuanced, and largely unnecessary for those who had lived the decision. Respect for the human bonds between operators ensured that personal relationships remained intact. The institutional line had been drawn and preserved. British Special Forces would not be subsumed into external command structures, no matter the coalition or scale. Years later, in August 2021, the images from Kabul and other Afghan cities arrived on screens worldwide. Afghans clinging to aircraft, Taliban entering government buildings without resistance, and the collapse of a government built over decades were stark reminders of war's impermanence. For veterans who had served in Helmand, it was a feeling without a precise name. Part grief, part guilt, part anger, and entirely rooted in witnessing the impermanence of their sacrifices. The letters folded in kit bags, the ones asking what winning looked like, had finally received their answer, not in clarity, but in undeniable reality. Khaled and his family were among those fortunate enough to leave. Sponsored by a former British handler, he arrived in Birmingham with his wife and daughter, who had never seen a city before. Work was found in a warehouse, sorting packages, a stark contrast to the life he had known in Helmand. He rarely spoke of Afghanistan, and when his daughter asked why they had left, he answered carefully, "So you could stay." The full meaning would come to her with time. Hundreds of other interpreters had not escaped, leaving a burden on those who had served alongside them, a reminder of the human cost beyond casualties and statistics. The SAS squadron commander, who had sent the radio message refusing JSOC authority, retired quietly. He did not seek recognition, interviews, or public attention. He lived the same disciplined, measured life he had always led. For him, the refusal had never been about pride or rebellion. It had been about doing what was right. The war, Helmand, and the lives lost had taught the operators that correctness often existed in the quiet spaces between chaos and expectation. Afghanistan, the operators learned, does not break armies. It shows them who they are. In the case of the SAS, it reaffirmed a truth embedded in their history: independence, judgment, and principle matter above all else. Across Garmsir, Nahar-e-Sarraj, and the green and barren stretches in between, the regiment had acted in accordance with doctrine, honor, and survival. They had moved through a war that challenged clarity, morality, and reason, and had emerged with identity intact. The memories, the losses, and the victories remained within them. The names of comrades, lost to IEDs, ambushes, and misfortune echoed quietly, folded into letters, thoughts, and reflections. The human connections with allies like Khalid endured, carrying the weight of experiences shared in one of the deadliest and most morally complex conflicts of a generation. The SAS had upheld principle in the face of operational pressure, navigated a coalition's bureaucracy without surrendering autonomy, and returned home, carrying lessons that could never be fully translated into words. In the end, Helmand was left as it had been, a mixture of beauty, resilience, danger, and contradiction. The operators had not broken it, nor had they fully shaped it. They had acted within the bounds of principle, survival, and doctrine. Afghanistan had tested them, and in doing so had shown them exactly who they were. And in the quiet moments that followed, on quiet streets, among green hills, in the stillness of home, the SAS carried forward that understanding, quietly, indelibly, and forever changed.